Welcome back. We're so glad that you can join us again for reading the Bible together. And we're going to continue with our Sermon on the Mount series this week. We wrapped up the Beatitudes last week, talked about how the God's law is something that needs to become internal instead of being a set of rules. And Jesus is going to expound further on that point as he continues in his sermon. You want to explain to us what we're going to be talking about this week?
Yes. Whenever you're looking at the Bible, one of the things that you always have to remember if you're going to understand what's there in the way it's supposed to be understood is the Bible from beginning to end is the story of Jesus. Now, we know about 2/3 of the Bible or 3/4 of the Bible is what we call the Old Testament. There are things in there, all sorts of things that like prophecies that talk about the Messiah coming, and there maybe symbols of sacrifice and so on that we associate with Jesus. But the whole story, in the final analysis, the whole story it really is pointing towards Jesus. Just an illustration of this in Genesis 3, verse 15, and everything goes back to Genesis. Mm-hmm. This is God talking to the serpent. The serpent. God talking to the serpent after Adam and Eve had been deceived and had eaten the forbidden fruit. And this is what God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Who is the offspring of the woman that God is talking about here? It's Jesus. Eventually, who was it that crushed the head of evil when he died on the cross? And of course, the crushing the head is a fatal blow. Striking the heel is a serious problem. But it's something that Christ, of course, was able to recover from the resurrection. But the point is, this is the very first mention of the redemption that's going to take place through the sacrifice of Jesus. This is in the 3rd chapter of the Bible. Then when we come to Matthew, we're reading out of Matthew, but before we have the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, we have these words, in those days John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness of Judea proclaiming, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. This is the one of whom the prophet Isaiah spoke when he said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And Jesus, the Lord, is coming, and we need to get ready. That's what John the Baptist, was saying. And then finally, Paul says in Galatians, he kind of sums the whole thing up. He says, when the fullness of time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. The important phrase there, when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. And so that kind of ties it together in some ways. The Bible is about Jesus. And so we're going to talk about Jesus and how he fulfills what was called the law and the prophets. That's how they referred to the Bible at that time. They didn't have one bound book that they could call the Hebrew Bible or whatever. So they talked about the law and the prophets, but that's what it was. And so that's what we're going to look at, is how Jesus talks about how he fulfills all of this, the law and the prophets.
And as we read this, we need to consider, we have the luxury of living in a time where, like you said, we have a book that's all bound up and it's all together. And so we have the luxury of looking through the whole thing and seeing the whole story all together, and we need to do that. But we tend to separate things, and we tend to look at Jesus and say, well, this musty Old Testament stuff is so difficult to understand, but I really connect with Jesus. So we need to look carefully at what Jesus says here, because Jesus is basically saying he is the fulfillment of the law. The law is important because here he is to fulfill it. So that's an important thing to make a note of. So let's start. We're gonna look at verses chapter 5 verses 13 to 20 today, but we're gonna start kind of in the middle and go to the end and then come back. So We're going to start with verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. This is what Jews at the time called the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, like he was saying. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so we're going to look at what all of that, we're going to break some of that down a little bit, but this would have been a very difficult statement for people to hear, because the scribes and the Pharisees were seen as being extremely pious. Now, they were seen as being extremely pious, but if we read the New Testament carefully, we can see some times where Jesus was basically calling them hypocrites and lots of other things. Sometimes looking at a different version of the scripture can really open up some things to us. So we're going to read a paraphrase from, let's see, this is from the
New International Commentary.
New International Commentary. This is a paraphrase of this section of the Gospel of Matthew. Do not suppose that I came to undermine the authority of the Old Testament scriptures, and in particular, the law of Moses. I did not come to set them aside, to bring into reality that did not come to set them aside, but to bring into reality that to which they pointed forward. I tell you truly, the law, down to its smallest details, is as permanent as heaven and earth and will never lose its significance. On the contrary, all that it points forward to will in fact become a reality, and is now doing so in my ministry. So anyone who treats even the most insignificant of the commandments of the law as of no value, and teaches others to belittle them as an unworthy representative, to belittle them is an unworthy representative of the new regime. While anyone who takes them seriously in word and in deed will be a true member of God's kingdom. But do not imagine that simply keeping all those rules will bring salvation. And we talked about this last week. It's not about keeping rules. For I tell you truly, it is only those whose righteousness of life goes far beyond that of the old policy of literal rule keeping, which the scribes and Pharisees represent, who will prove to be God's true people in this era of fulfillment. So, fulfilling the law. Jesus is fulfilling the law. He is showing its true significance. And so, it's obvious, he says, we have to be as righteous as the scribes and Pharisees. And it's obvious that they are being very, very careful about following the rules. All these little, just tiny details, Oh, we're not just tithing our money, we're tithing our spices, for instance. And Jesus says that's not going to work. Okay? He says, therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. So, he doesn't want us to disrespect them. And the better translation would be to treat them as worthless. So we need to recognize the importance of those rules and the meanings of all of those detailed commands of the Old Testament. We aren't going to follow them in the same way. I'm not worried about, if one part of my garment is made out of a different fabric than another part, although that was a very important rule in the Old Testament. But I'm not like going to sit here and, analyze the makeup of what I'm wearing. But even so, understanding that the importance of the purity and the difference that represented in the people of God at that time is important. And giving this command to be more pure than and follow the law with more detail than the Pharisees and the scribes, Jesus is telling us to dig down deeper. So Jesus is going to show us what he means by the law and the prophets and how he understands them. Let's talk about that in this next section. You want to talk about the salt and light?
Salt and light. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Now, salt in those times, it wasn't used like it is today. It was much more than just a spice. It was a preservative, and people salted meat and fish so they would not spoil. That was about that. That was unless you lived in a dry climate where you could dry it and turn it into jerky or something like that. You had to use salt to preserve it. So salt was a valuable commodity. It was very important for if you were going to have anything but vegetables to eat. So that's what salt was for. It preserved things. God's people are supposed to be a strong, positive influence in the world. From the very beginning, the law giving of Moses through the time of the prophets, what had happened is God's people, many of them at least, had lost their saltiness. They were not out in the world trying to preserve. If you're not salty compared to the world, then you cannot show anyone what it's like to follow Jesus. Salt is strong. A little bit of salt, it dissolves and it goes into whatever it goes into, and you can taste it. If you put too much salt and it doesn't, it can do that accidentally, and it's pretty strong. But it's because in nature, a little bit of salt can do influence a lot of the things it gets into. So if you're not salty anymore, if you don't have that contrast between yourself and the world around you, then you've lost your saltiness, and that's what Jesus is talking about here.
So salt and light. The light. If we're living in darkness, and that metaphor is used a lot in the New Testament, you cannot see what you need to see. And so God's light shows things up. It shows up evil, and it helps people find their way. In Isaiah 42:6, it says, I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. And Israel was supposed to be a light to the nations, and they had basically abdicated that responsibility over and over again. Way back, once again in Genesis 12, that is what God told Abraham he was supposed to be doing, and that his descendants were going to do. He was making Abraham a great nation so that he could be a light to the other nations. And so that's what he was hoping Israel would be, and he continued to work with them and work with them and work with them to make that happen, and they just continued to go their own way. Now, he says a city on a hill. Most cities were at the base of hills, so they'd be near sources of water, but Jerusalem was at the top of a hill. So this is symbolic of where God's people would come up to meet him. This idea of God's dwelling, a temple, a place where the people could come to meet with him, and he could come down to meet with them. And so that kind of gets blended together with this idea of light. Light needs to be in a prominent place. So without being obnoxious, because again, we talked about last week, we're called to be peacemakers. At the same time, though, as Christians, our lives should be a prominent evidence of God's light to those around us.
So, just by way of review and application, God reached out to his chosen people in all sorts of ways to show them how to live so that they could show the rest of the world how to live. Most of the time, most of them failed at this task. Jesus claimed to clarify what God wanted and to show how it could be done if they and we follow him and become part of his kingdom, acknowledge him as king. And part of our role is to be salt and light. And we'll conclude with this one very important verse in what we've just read about what Jesus said. Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven.